And I will start with another important topic, which is about the transnational corporations and activities of transnational corporations in the world economy. So they are very important actors in the world economy, beside the beside the different economies which you have already learned about. And so today I will speak about the global value chains which have been created by the transnational corporations. And first, I will define this term, the term of value chain or global value chain. Every company has different activities, and activities we can find from the conception of a product to its end use and beyond that. And we called these activities we can say they create a so-called value chain in the company. So in the value chain of a company, we can find different activities, and we can speak about the design, the production, marketing, distribution, support to the final consumers. And of course, I can continue this list. So I can mention I could mention other activities of the companies. And these kind of activities in a value chain can be undertaken by a single company, or these activities can be divided among several firms. And so the different activities of a value chain can be concentrated at one location, or can be spread out over different locations. And so that is why we call a value chain, we can call a value chain as a global value chain. That means the different activities of a company are in different geographical locations. So we can speak about the dispersion of value chain activities across the world. And today I will speak about these dispersions of value chains of different companies across the world. And many companies have broken up their value chains and their activities, and especially production is very fragmented geographically, this activity. But of course, we can speak about the dispersion of other activities as well. So many companies have distributed production stages across many countries. We could see the creation of production networks. And the global value chains of the transnational corporations are very heterogeneous across industries, companies, products, and services. So they are very heterogeneous. And I will speak about the development of the global value chains when these global value chains were created by the transnational corporations. So this will be this is very important to know, and you have to learn for the exam. So we can differentiate three phases of the global integration, or we can say economic integration or economic globalization. So we can differentiate three phases. And so the economic globalization or international economic integration dates back to the mid 19th century. So, and in the predecessors of the transnational corporations appeared in this century, so in the 19th century, and we could see that the international trade, the cross-border flows of financial capital and the labor significantly increased in that century. And we could see industrialization of Japan, North America, and Europe, especially western part of Europe. And we could also see the increase in income disparity between North and South. So the globalization, the economic globalization started in the 19th centuries, in the mid of the 19th century. And we could see a more intensive trade, international trade of goods and cross-border flows of financial capital. And maybe you know it, you have already heard about it, that there is a very big migration of labor, especially unskilled laborers. They went from Europe to the United States in the second part of the 19th century. And this phase of the globalization stalled or retreated after the imposition of protectionist measures following the Second World War. So we could see a very intensive economic globalization or international economic integration till the end of the First World War. And after this process stalled, because several protectionist measures, especially in the trade relations after the First World War. And the new phase started only after the Second World War. So the new phase of the economic globalization took off again after the Second World War. And what we could see after the Second World War in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, we could see, or we can economic globalization has been characterized by strong growth of international trade and investment. And this rapid growth of international trade was supported by the falling obstacles to trade and declining transport costs, which was a result of technological innovations. And between the two world wars, we could see protectionist measurements in the international trade. And after the Second World War, industrialized countries decided to decrease this type of protectionist measurements, and they concluded a multilateral agreement, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and that is why they could decrease the obstacles to trade, the different tariffs and non-tariff barriers. And this gave an impetus to the international trade again in the 50s and 60s and the 70s. And of course, we could see as I mentioned, we could see declining transport costs as a result of technological innovations. And of course, in the field of capital movements, we also see liberalization. So the countries eliminated several restrictions on foreign direct investments and multinational enterprises. This also supported the internationalization of companies, of different companies. And most of the companies which internationalized, they had a headquarters mainly in OECD countries, so in developed countries, and they went abroad. So these companies from OECD countries went abroad and they established affiliates or subsidiaries in foreign markets. And we could see in this phase of the globalization, we could see the separation of production and consumption, and the falling transport costs and tariffs made it possible to ship and trade goods internationally. So these things helped the growth of the international trade. And on the other hand, we could see still that that the location of large-scale manufacturing plants and industries, so this location was concentrated, geographically concentrated in developed economies. So that means in the global industry and manufacturing, so the developed economies and the companies of developed economies had a very high share in the large scale manufacturing, and these manufacturing plants concentrated, and the production is concentrated in developed economies. So we couldn't see a separation and fragmentation or very big fragmentation, wide fragmentation of the production processes in this phase. So most companies undertook all stages of production process, it would be not possible. Would have been for them. It was not possible to coordinate geographically disparate activities. So it for them. It was better to concentrate the production at one location in this phase. Of course, we could see the predecessors of the global value chains in the northern part of the world economy. I mean, in the industrialized countries, we could see the initial development of global value chains, but they only concentrated in the developed countries. That means we could see production sharing between the USA and Canada in the automotive industry, or in the European Union, or this is European Economic Community. This was we can say, the predecessor of the EU. So in the machinery industry, we could see production sharing. That means the companies from developed countries went abroad, usually to the neighboring country, to neighboring developed countries, and they created production networks. They created production sharing in the automotive industry, in the machinery industry. So we call these type of global value chains north-north global value chains, because most of the companies were from developed countries, and they went to invest in developed countries. And a new phase of the economic globalization started in the 1980s. And so in this phase, we could see a very rapid growth in the trade and the foreign direct investments, and we could see a rapid development of global value chains. So we will see that new and more countries join the global value chains, and more economies join the global value chains. And this new phase, this is a more intensive phase of the economic globalization, and we could see a strong decline in communication costs, and this strong decline in the communication costs facilitated a more intensive economic globalization. And with modern communication networks, the various stages of production can be linked across greater physical distances. So the modern communication networks have made the fragmentation of the production possible in this new era. And the companies started to create global value chains to benefit from the difference in wage costs between developed and developing countries. So in the previous phase, I mentioned that production sharing was created between developed countries, and so the main actors were developed countries or developed countries companies. And in the new phase, we could see that the companies from developed countries started to invest in developing countries. So production sharing started to evolve between developed and developing countries. And the southern part of the world economy, I mean the developing countries, they started to industrialize and grow rapidly. I think you have already heard about the industrialized countries and emerging economies. So the industrialization of developing countries was induced by the foreign direct investments of developed countries. So we could see in this new phase a production sharing between developed and developing countries. And firstly, East and Southeast Asian countries joined the global value chains. So the developing countries from East and Southeast Asian region joined the global value chains at the end of the 1970s. And so the participation in global value chains facilitated the industrialization of developing countries. And of course, the developing countries prioritized foreign direct investments, and so they needed capital, foreign capital, to realize industrialization programs, and they supported the foreign direct investments with different economic policy measurements. For example, they unilaterally decreased the tariffs. They introduced such policies which were very attractive to foreign direct investors. So they introduced different initiatives for incentives for the foreign investors, and they also concluded free trade agreements, which were very important for foreign companies, because the foreign affiliates usually import a lot of products, parts and components from the country of their origin, and that is why for them it's very important to import without tariffs. And so far I have been talking about global value chains, but it is better to say that these global value chains are regionally concentrated. So the global value chains have three big regional blocks. So we can see in the world economy three big regional blocks of global value chains. We could see global value chains, one regional global value block, one regional block of global value chains in East Asia. East Asia and Southeast Asia together, so the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia, plus China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. The other regional block of global value chains is the European Union, and the third one is NAFTA, which is a free trade agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And nowadays we call it USMCA, but this is the same agreement. So the same, the USMCA is for United States, Mexico, and Canada. And NAFTA, this was the previous name for this free trade area. And so these are the three big regional blocks of global value chains in the world economy. Of course, other parts of the world economy have also joined the global value chains, but we could see a regional concentration of these global value chains in these three regions, which I have just mentioned. And in these three blocks, we have to emphasize the role of Japan, Germany, and USA. So they are very important hubs in their own regional blocks. So Japan in East Asia, Germany in the European Union, and the USA in NAFTA. In case of East Asia, I think we have to also emphasize the role of China. And so other regional partner countries depend heavily on their exports. I mean, Japan's, Germany's, and the US exports of parts and components. And the global value chains and the development of the global value chains has changed the structure of the international trade significantly. And nowadays we could see that the international trade consists of imports and exports of intermediates. That means parts and components. Of course, the countries trade in final goods as well and capital goods as well, but a very big, so the parts and components or intermediate products, they have a very high share in the international trade, in the global imports and global exports, because of the fragmentation of the production and because of the production networks which have been created by the transnational corporation across the world, across the world economy. And approximately 60–80% of the total global trade are related to global value chains, which are coordinated by the transnational corporations. That means if we look at the data of the global production or trade or investment, we can say that most of the global production, trade, and investments are related to the transnational corporations. And so global production, trade, and investment increasingly take place as part of global value chains. And we can see that, so since the 1980s, we can speak about more intensive economic globalization, and this is determined by the global value chains. And global value chains have increased the speed, the scale, and the complexity of economic globalization. We can see that global value chains have deepened the process of the globalization geographically. I have mentioned that in the 50s and in the 60s, 70s, the foreign direct investments happened among the developed countries. So I mentioned that only the global value chains, we could see global value chains, but only north global value chains. So mainly developed countries participated in the global value chains, but since the 1980s, we could see a difference. We could see a different type of globalization. We could see a production sharing between developed countries and developing countries, and especially emerging economies started to participate in the global value chains. And we can also speak about the internationalization, not only about the internationalization of manufacturing sector, but also we could see the internationalization of the services industries. That means companies which are active which are operating in the services or service sector, they also internationalize their activities across the world economy. And we can also mention that the global value chains have deepened the process of globalization functionally. That means, here I emphasize that the fragmentation of production is very important, but we can also see that R&D activities are also internationalized. So many companies bring their R&D activities abroad, and they make innovations abroad. And here I would like to cite a survey of the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics, and this survey reported that they made a survey of 300 global companies, and they reported that for the group of these 300 global companies, on average, 51% of the component manufacturing, 47% of final assembly, 46% of warehousing, 43% of customer service, and 39% of product development took place outside the home country. So this reflects the internationalization of different activities of the company, of these companies, and we can say this is the internationalization of the value chain activities of these companies. And I hope you can see it. You can see this this figure. At the beginning, I was talking about that global value chain activities can be concentrated at one location, and of course, only one company can do every activity, but it is very rare nowadays, and a company can have foreign affiliates, foreign subsidiaries. They can buy components from foreign suppliers, domestic suppliers, and here you can see the offshoring and outsourcing processes of a company. So you can see here the within firm and outside firm relations. Domestic, so we can speak about a home country, and we can speak about the company which has a home country, and this company create affiliates, subsidiaries abroad. This is the foreign affiliates in the host country, which means they receive foreign direct investments, and a company from a home country can buy products from foreign suppliers, or they can buy parts and components from domestic suppliers. So here we can see many arrows and many relations inside the company and outside the company. And sorry, I make it a little bit smaller. Yes. So we can see many relations, different relations between companies and suppliers and affiliates. So nowadays, a production of different products can be undertaken by companies, mother companies, then their affiliates and their suppliers. And here I would like to speak about the drivers of the global value chains. I have already talked about the different factors which influence the development of the global value chains. And we can say that the emergence of global value chains and the international fragmentation of production have been fueled by falling trade costs and plummeting communication and information costs. These falling trade costs and plummeting in communication and information costs have made international sourcing of intermediates cheaper and easier. And what are the trade costs? In case of goods, we can speak about transport and port costs, freight and insurance costs, tariffs and duties, markups by importers, wholesalers and retailers. And in case of services, the trade costs include transport costs, trade costs include communication costs. So in case of the services, the trade costs include the communication costs. And for the transnational corporation, it is very important to reduce the trade costs, because the intermediates are often cross borders. Intermediates, I mean parts and components of different products, often cross borders in the global value chains, and for them, so the trade costs, the decrease of the trade costs is very important. And of course, the decrease of the trade costs have been significantly determined by falling trade and investment barriers. So the liberalization of trade and investment have significantly supported the decrease of the trade costs. So the trade liberalization, I mean the international trade, so the liberalization of the international trade started in the 40s, so after the Second World War, it's better to say after the Second World Wars, at the end of the 40s. And we could see falling tariffs, especially the tariffs for industrial goods are very low nowadays. And we can also see multilateral liberalization of non-tariff barriers. So these things support the trade, and they through the decrease of the trade costs. And here I also have to mention, the Information Technology Agreement, which is an agreement under the WTO, the World Trade Organization. This was concluded at the end of the 1990s. Not every WTO member signed this agreement, but those economies which are very active in the ICT, electronics, information communication technology, and electronics industries, which are integrated in these global value chains, they signed this agreement because they try to reduce the tariffs on these ICT, information telecommunication technology and electronics products. So this is also very important agreement which supported the decrease of the trade costs, and in this way it supported the global trade and the emergence of the global value chains. And the global value chains, the emergence and the development of the global value chains was also supported by the liberalization of investments. So the liberalization of investments started already in the 50s and 60s, and this was we can say this is a continuous process, and the countries in the world economy, they often conclude bilateral agreements or regional agreements on foreign direct investments, or we can speak about multilateral agreements on foreign direct investments. And these agreements help the spread of the foreign direct investments because they include several liberalization measurements, so they diminish several barriers against the foreign direct investments, and in this way they support the spread of the global value chains. And in many emerging economies which would like to be very attractive for the foreign investors, they made a lot of investment reforms, and these things help them to integrate into the global value chains. And there were several regulatory reforms in key transport and infrastructure sectors, which have also facilitated moving activities across borders, so they help the spread of the global value chains. And I have mentioned that the falling communication costs supported the more intensive globalization process, the more intensive spread of the global value chains, and this was made by so this was supported by the technological breakthroughs in ICT sector. So we could see a rapid increase in the communication networks, and this is very important in the latest phase of the globalization process. And why companies go abroad? What are the motivations for them? Here I listed some factors which are motivating the spread of the value chains of the companies. First, companies would like to, which go abroad, invest abroad, they would like to attain lower costs and achieve a greater efficiency. So this is very important for them, and this is an important factor behind the expansion of the global value chains. And the second important motivation is access to foreign markets. So they go abroad because they would like to expand their markets, and a local presence often helps firms better to understand and exploit markets abroad. And the third motivation is access to knowledge and technology. So they often go abroad because, companies go abroad because they would like to acquire other companies with more advanced technology, or they would like to obtain access to skilled workers, technological expertise, or they would like to be closer to the competitors. And I think these things which you have to know about the motivations for the spread of the global value chains. And in the global value chains, I have already mentioned big companies which create affiliates abroad, and they buy different parts and components from suppliers, maybe domestic suppliers or from foreign suppliers. So MNE, this is multinational enterprises, but we can call them also as transnational corporations. So multinational enterprises or transnational corporations, they are principal actors in the global value chains. And most of the exports are related to big multinational enterprises or global or transnational corporations. Here, I would like to show you an example. In case of Europe, we see that 1% of companies account for 40% of the whole exports, or 5% of companies account for 70% of the whole exports in Europe, and only 10% of companies account for 80% of the whole exports in Europe. That means the exports are concentrated in big transnational corporations, and similar results we can see in case of the United States. And so in the global value chains, the big companies are very important actors. And usually the small and medium enterprises, the smaller companies, they also participate in the global value chains. They usually supply intermediates, that means parts and components, to exporting firms. And usually they are participate in the domestic value chains. This is also true. I think the small and medium enterprises are very important. For example, in case of the United States, or in Japan, or in Germany, in big economies, we could see several small and medium enterprises or firms which are integrated into the domestic value chains, and they supply intermediates to exporting firms to big companies. And this is the last topic which I would like to speak about. First, I would like to ask, do you have any questions regarding this topic which you have already heard? So tell me if something is not clear. If it is clear, then I will continue with different indicators. So nowadays, so many economies, developing and developed economies as well. So many economies participate in the global value chains, but the participation is not equal. So some countries are more integrated into the global value chains. Some countries are not really participating in the global value chain. And we can measure with different indicators. We can measure the participation of a country in global value chains with different indicators. One important indicator is the foreign value added content of exports. That means, for example, in case of Hungary, we can see that companies which are active, especially in the automotive industry or electronics industry, they import a lot of parts and components which are assembled into final goods or semi-final goods. And then these companies export these goods. That means in the exports, we can see a very high share of imports. This is the indicator which I have just mentioned, the indicator of foreign value added content of exports. And we see that foreign content of exports has generally increased in the past decades, but economies differ significantly in this respect. I have mentioned this. Foreign value added clearly depends on economies' size and patterns of specialization. So small economies like Hungary tend to have higher shares in foreign value added embodied in their exports. So the foreign value added content of exports is very high in case of small economies. Here you can see a figure. So foreign value added content of exports by country, I think these are the OECD economies. And you can see that Hungary, for example, in case of Hungary, we could see this indicator is near to 40 or over 40%. That means, so the foreign value added share is very high in the exports, 40%. But in Slovak Republic, this is also very high, but in case of Luxembourg is more higher. In case of Ireland, this is, or in case of South Korea, this share is very high. And I have mentioned that in case of large economies, in case of Japan or the United States, we could see that, so these are big economies. They have a very big size of, their economies have a very big size, and companies in Japan or in the United States rely more on domestic companies. They domestically they purchase many intermediate goods from domestic companies, and they less reliant on foreign imports and intermediates. And that is why the foreign value added content of their exports is much lower. So here you can see, so at the end of the this, or it is better to say on the right side, Japan, United States. So you can see a very low share, if you compare with others, a very low share of foreign value added content of their exports. And here you can see also Norway and Australia. So these countries are very rich in natural resources. So they have lower ratios of foreign value added in exports, because mining activities require fewer intermediate goods in the production process. This is also true for Norway. So that is why I told you that foreign value added content of exports, it clearly depends on the economy's size and patterns of specialization. So smaller economies more rely on imports, and that is why they have a very more higher share of foreign value added in the exports. And in big economies such as the United States or Japan, so they have a very big sector of small and medium enterprises, and they rely more on intermediate goods which are produced by domestic companies, and they are less reliant on foreign imports of intermediates. And of course, those countries which have abundant natural resources, and they important exporters of natural resources, they have lower ratios of foreign value added in exports. So the size of the economy is important, as I mentioned, but another topic is another factor is important. This is the specialization pattern of the country. So the economic structure and the export composition of a country, it also determines, so these things, the economic structure and the export composition determine the importance of foreign value added content in the exports. A high level of heterogeneity in global value chains exists across products and industries. Foreign value added is very large in basic industries such as coke and refined petroleum, basic metals, chemicals, rubber, and plastics, and large in high-tech industries like where we can see a very high production fragmentation in case of electrical, office, computing machinery, TV, radio, communication equipment, motor vehicles. So here you can see the foreign value added content of exports by industry. This is an OECD average. So this is for the OECD countries in an average way. So here you can see that in case of these exports of coke, refined petroleum, radio, TV, and communication equipment, computing and office machinery, in case of motor vehicles, we could see very high foreign value added content of the exports. And in case of mining and quarrying or education or different, I would better to say service sector, we could see a very low value added content. Yeah, so in case of Hungary, we are, so our country is specialized in so automotive industry is very important for us, and also we produce several, we assemble several electronic goods, and in this industry and the exports of these products have a very high share. In these exports, we could see a very high share of foreign value-added content. So we import a lot of parts and components from different countries. In case of automobile industry, we especially import a lot of parts and goods from Germany, and we assemble these parts and components, and we export final products such as motors or cars. And I mentioned that we can speak about regional concentration of the global value chains. And I mentioned three big blocks of global value chains, three regional blocks of global value chains: the East Asia, European Union, and NAFTA. And so global value chains have a very strong regional focus. That means the foreign value added of economies exports originate largely in neighboring economies. So in most European countries, between 60 and 70% of the foreign value added content of exports comes from the other European countries. Yeah, I mentioned in case of Hungary, for example, Germany is our biggest. I think the foreign value-added content is from Germany. In case of Hungary, the biggest share in the foreign value-added content is from Germany, and in case of NAFTA, we could see that Canada and Mexico are heavily oriented towards other NAFTA countries, particularly the USA. So almost half of important intermediates embodied in their exports originates in the NAFTA zone. So in case of Asia, we also see that the majority of the intermediates embodied in exports are sourced from within the region, and this reflects the importance of the factory in Asia. And usually the developed countries such as Japan and South Korea or Taiwan, they produce parts and components, and they export these parts and components to developing countries, and they assemble these parts and components into a final goods. And it is better, I think these figures will help to understand these things. This figure shows the origin of value-added content of exports. In case of European countries, so here you can see the lighter blue this means from Europe. So these countries, so these are European countries, and that means the high share of foreign value-added content of their exports are from Europe. So other European countries supply them with imports with different parts and components, and they which they are built into their exports. So in case of Hungary, we can see this is almost 70%. So I have mentioned that in case of Hungary, we see that the foreign value added content of exports is 40%, and more than or nearly 70% of the foreign value added content of the Hungarian exports are from other European countries. But Europe's share is very high in other European countries as well. And this also reflects that global value chains are regionally concentrated. And so we can see a regional fragmentation of the production in Europe, and this is also true for other regions, for Americas and for Asia. NAFTA, this is great. This is for NAFTA, and as I mentioned, in case of Canada and Mexico, we could see that 50% of the foreign value added content of the exports are from other NAFTA countries, in case of Canada and Mexico. In Asia, this is East Asia, and this is ASEAN, this is Southeast Asia. And if we go here, then we could see this is East Asia, and this is ASEAN. So usually high share, we could see a high share of Asia in the foreign value added content of their exports. And so now I was I tried to explain the only one side of this process. So I have been talking about the foreign value added content of the exports of different countries, but it is also true that, for example, Hungary also produce several parts and components which they export, and these exports will become part of the exports of other countries. So we could see so-called forward and backward linkages of the countries. So economies participate in the global value chains, both as users of foreign inputs and suppliers of intermediate goods and services used in other economies' exports. So we can speak about backward linkages and forward linkages. In case of Hungary, I have mentioned that the backward participation, that means foreign value added share in the exports is above 40%. But of course, Hungary supply other countries with inputs, and they these inputs are built in the exports of those countries. So, but the forward linkages is not so strong in case of Hungary. This is the gray. So forward participation in the global value chains in case of Hungary is not so strong if you compared with the backward participation. So here you can see this is the participation index, which includes the backward linkage and the forward linkage. This indicates the share of foreign inputs in economies' exports. This is the backward linkage. And the domestically produced inputs used in third economies' exports. This is the forward linkages, and this reflects the participation of different countries in the global value chains. And the participation index usually is very high in small open economies. So Hungary is a small open economies. They are more integrated into the global production networks. So on the right side of this figure, you can see United States or Canada. So they have a lower share of participation, and the forward linkage is much more important in case of Japan or in United States or United Kingdom. So they have a higher share, a higher indicator for forward participation. So now I will summarize the things you have to know. Professor Lukács will continue with this topic in the next Tuesday, but I will tell you what you have to know for the exam. So first you have to know the definition of the global value chain. First the value chain and and the global value chain. And you have to know the different phases of the economic globalization. The first phase, so we could see the start of the economic globalization, and then this process stalled for a certain time, and again we could see the recovery in the globalization after the Second World War, but we couldn't see the spread of the global value chains or the fragmentation of the production during the second phase. We could only see north-north global value chains, so production sharing between developed countries, between USA and Canada, and in the EU. We also see some production sharing in the machinery industry, and then the third phase started in the 1980s, and we could see a strong decline in the communication costs, and we could see the start of the fragmentation of the different value chain activities, especially the production, and we could see production sharing between developing and developed countries, and we could see the start of the industrialization of developing countries. And also you have to know that we speak about global value chains, but nowadays, it is better to say there are 3 regional blocks of global value chains: East Asia, EU, and NAFTA. East Asia also includes Southeast Asia, And you have to know the role of the transnational corporations in the global trade. So 60–80% of the total global trade are related to global value chains. So the global production, the trade and investment increasingly take place as a part of global value chains. And you have to know the drivers of global value chains, the falling trade costs, and you have to know these different costs which belong to the trade costs, and you have to know that it is an important driver, the planting communication and information costs, which is due to the ICT, that information and technology development has made possible made the communication cheaper. And this was an important driver for global value chains, because the different affiliates, subsidiaries of transnational corporations can communicate easily through the communication developed advanced communication networks, and they can coordinate. So companies, transnational corporations can connect their activities in different geographical locations. And you have to know the motivations for the spread of the global value chains, the efficiency-seeking, market-seeking, and strategic asset-seeking motivations for these companies and transnational corporations or transnational companies. And you have to know these type of indicators, which describes the participation of different countries in the global value chains. Important indicator is the foreign value added content of exports, which explains the backward linkages of a certain country. Of course, this share and foreign value added share in the exports is different. This share depends on the economy, the size of a certain economy, or patterns of specialization of different economies. And usually small economies are more reliant on imports, and they have a very high, usually have very high share, imported input share in their exports. Large economies, they are not so reliant on imported inputs. They can purchase many intermediates from domestic companies. And of course, this foreign value-added content, it can be explained by the specialization of a certain country. So in case of this coke, refined petroleum, chemicals, rubbers, and plastics, and in case of high-tech products, we can see a very high share of foreign value-added content in the exports. And I explained that through this indicator that this indicator, the origin of the foreign value added content of exports, shows that the global value chains are regionally concentrated. And the third indicator, participation index, is together shows the backward linkage and the forward linkage of a country. This is also very important to know. And here you can see your references. You can download this publication of the OECD and you can read more about this, but you have to only know which you can see here in the slides. So you only have to know for the exam, which you can see here in the slides. Do you have any questions regarding this topic, so the global value chains?
No.
If not, then thank you very much for your attention. And this topic will be continued next week, but by Professor Lukács. So thank you very much and have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Nagyjából tudom, csak ilyenkor... Goodbye. Igen. A leasing cégtől az igazolás. Akkor van a... Igen. Igen. Sok minden kellett, nem emlékszik erre, mert ezek megvannak. Forgalmi terület, törzskönyv, meghatalmazás, igazolás arról, hogy